Welcome to the 17th episode of the Student Recap Podcast, Great Geopolitics 3. Today I'm here with Benjamin, and we'll be discussing the most recent updates and what's happened in the world. Now we're going to start with the conflict in Syria, in which the rebels, including the main group HTS, have overthrown the Assad regime. Benjamin, you want to start that story?
So the HTS rebels and others started fighting against the Assad regime and started pushing them back towards the capital, which happened very slowly at first, but then as more soldiers started running out of supplies and the logistics started to collapse, the capital was very quickly captured by rebels and overthrew the Assad regime and whatever his name was. Do you remember?
Uh, Bashar al-Assad?
Yeah.
In 2013, rebels, as part of the Arab Spring, they tried to overthrow the Syrian government, but Moscow and Iran both helped government forces in Syria to quell the rebellion, and they even used chemical warfare against their civilians, which is a war crime. And they've imprisoned dozens, or probably hundreds of people in these torture prisons that just now all these people are being released from, and there were even Americans in those prisons. And basically, these rebels, they come from a bunch of different ethnic groups, including the Kurds, and they're all angry at the government, which was the Assad regime, because they had been oppressing the people regardless of who they were, just because they tried to have free democracy. And now there's a bit of a problem because the power vacuum, uh, ISIS is still in the south of Syria, and the US is trying to prevent ISIS from getting control of the country since there's no real leadership right now.
Yeah, so after the fall of the Assad regime, the US bombed 75 ISIS-related targets immediately after the fall, and I believe Israel also bombed a few targets of known ISIS locations.
And the US, it actually has a large base in eastern Syria, if I'm correct, and it's
Yes.
located in literally the middle of the Syrian desert. It's not.
So, the I believe they had an agreement with the Russians where the Americans would stay on the east side of the Euphrates and the Russians would be on the west side. But after the fall of the Assad regime, which was supported by Russia, the US started attacking ISIS locations on the west side of the Euphrates because Russia pulled out of Syria and also rescued the surviving parts of the Assad regime.
And adding on to that, Turkey and Iran are now in some troubles because Erdogan, he was supporting some militias in the north of Syria in Idlib province, not HTS but other militias that helped in the rebellion, and that is contrary to the Iraqi-backed militias that invaded Syria to help government forces defeat the rebellion. So now the Ayatollah is probably a bit annoyed at Turkey. And there's just a more about that power vacuum. The power vacuum that's been assumed, even HTS, which is the rebel group, they disassembled the constitution, and I think parliament has been disbanded as well, which is pretty bad. Because the government, even though it did maintain parliament, you don't just destroy parliament once you create a new government. HTS, it's a rebel group, and it's based off of Al Qaeda, but its leader, Abu Muhammad Jolani, says he's more moderate now. Even though that is true, they don't have any governmental practice. They don't know what to do to run a country.
I believe they're not based off of what do you say? Uh Al Qaeda. I believe they're a former Al Qaeda affiliate.
Former Al Qaeda affiliates, my bad. And they were actually became more moderate because during the Civil War, there are very disparaging views as Syria, it's multi-ethnic and multi-religious. So there's Christians closer to Lebanon, Muslims obviously, and the Sunni Shia split, and then Kurds, which are another group, but their views of religion are a little bit different. and then also probably some Assyrian refugees from Iraq in the Far East. And basically, HTS, it was too extreme to run the country, so they needed to be able to have a view that wasn't as extreme for the people to like them and for them to be able to gain support and be able to mobilize in order to control the country. Another side note, the rebellion that took over Syria started on, I believe it was November 30th or very early December in Idlib province, and the rebels, they quickly took 3 or 4 cities such as Aleppo, Homs, and then Hama, and then by Saturday of the next week, the rebels had already taken Damascus and the government had fallen. You want to move on to the next topic, Benjamin?
Yeah, let's move on.
Okay, so pretty important. President-elect Donald Trump, he has proposed tariffs of 25% on a majority of countries, and there's some specificities for other goods, especially from China. So you want to give some background on that?
Okay, so the tariffs on Mexico and Canada are to try to force their governments to crack down on cartels, which from Mexico I can understand, but Canada doesn't really make sense to me. But for the Mexico cartels and stuff, a significant majority of illegal substances and narcotics, such as fentanyl, methamphetamine, and cocaine, are trafficked across the U.S.-Mexico border, creating crises in the United States. And the 25% tariff is aimed at forcing the Mexican government's hand in aiding the U.S.'s fight against cartels.
And more on that Canada thing. So this tariff set, it's mostly structured towards pre-manufactured goods, such as goods coming from China, and not exactly raw goods. Like Canada, sure, we buy lumber from them, but that's only going to increase the price of lumber inside the U.S. It's not really going to change the amount of pre-manufactured goods that are coming from Canada into the U.S. because there aren't that many to start with.
Okay. So, yeah, pre-manufactured goods, a tariff on that makes sense if you're trying to like support U.S. manufacturing jobs.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you tariff raw materials, it would increase the price of manufacturing for everyone. But pre-manufactured goods just is aimed at getting more American jobs and supporting the American industrial base.
And yeah, more on that industrial American base. So, most of our industries we've had in our country for a really long time, but there's some industries that the US simply just doesn't have. Uh, Such as like the plastic industry. We're not going to make plastic for really cheap like China does. And neither do American citizens want to be working in factories to make that plastic. So I think the China thing is a bit of a long-term dilemma because if we don't produce it and we increase the price of how much it costs to get it here, it's going to have a potentially negative outcome.
I believe the China tariffs are just to punish them for their actions in the East China Sea, especially around the Philippines
Mhm.
and Taiwan.
Yeah, and the Chinese tariffs on imported goods was already 15%, so upping it to 25% is very different from, let's say, Canada, which we probably had a 0% tariff, probably according to NAFTA. I'll have to research that later.
There's probably some tariff on Canada goods, but it's probably not 25%, like you said they were changing it to.
Yeah, and do you know if these tariffs apply to like every country in the world, or is it just
I
Canada,
believe he
China,
said a
Mexico?
10% universal tariff on imports to the United States.
Okay, so it is pretty far reaching. And I don't think it's going to affect quote unquote normal American goods, but I believe it will affect supermarket prices to an extent, right? Because those raw goods with that 10% tariff will have to increase, or the margins of supermarkets will just get lower.
Um, it's probably going to end up being a little bit of both.
I see,
But
because you know how like champagne is a UNESCO World Heritage food and you can only import it from France. Therefore, champagne's going to be 10% more expensive theoretically.
um, I mean,
I guess
it's
it
not
works,
going to
but it's
be.
all theoretical.
He's not increasing tariffs by 10%. He's implementing a 10% universal tariff. But there's probably already a tax on imported goods.
Oh yeah, and I also forgot that champagne's alcoholic, so there's probably something for that as well.
There's also probably a different tax for that, yes.
And what I think is the strangest with Trump's policies is that he's not going at the direct problem, right? But these problems, I feel like they require more international solution making than just trying to be like, oh, I'm going to put the tariff in. Well, we
Well,
can
for
arrange
us
something with
to
Mexico that they have to have higher security for inspecting cargo coming into
Rafa,
Mexico because those precursor chemicals that China's sending over to Mexico could be like found, and if they know there's some links to the cartel with that further investigation, the like leading of those chemicals to being created into fentanyl would be lower.
well, currently, I believe the Mexican government is not fully cooperating with the United States government and allowing the US to send federal law enforcement agents and military personnel to help in their fight against the cartel.
Mm-hmm.
Currently, I believe Mexico is mostly leading an independent fight against the cartels, and the goal of the Trump tariff is to allow the US to also aid in that fight, along with actually crack down on the cartels purposefully.
The only thing
But
that
the
Mexico,
precursor chemicals also may have like an actual legal use as well, but um, it's also not that hard to smuggle stuff across the border
the only thing that
right now.
Mexico, as I was trying to say, is that they can't fight the cartel war alone, and there are some government officials that are complicit in getting the cartels the drugs they need, I believe.
Well, they can't fight the cartels alone, but they think they can right now.
Yeah, that's the
Or the
problem.
cartel is, whispering in their ear saying, don't allow the US to help.
So moving on, there were two major movements in like global leaders recently. So I would say the more important one in South Korea, the president Moon, I believe, he declared martial law about a week ago. Then 10 hours later, Parliament broke into the parliamentary building, had a vote, and overruled it. And that was only 10 hours later. And
Yeah, so
so
the
basically,
reason, okay.
right, martial law, it's very extreme and you don't just like enact it out of nowhere, right, Benjamin?
Yeah, so at the time of enacting martial law, he said that it was to prevent North Korea from doing shenanigans or something. And then after martial law was ended, either him or a spokesperson for him said that he enacted martial law because he was feeling lonely.
I
But
find it so strange that you would just make such a brash decision in government because it's like I'm feeling lonely, let me declare martial law and the military now has control. Like what?
I don't know.
And then the second major movement in world leaders was Michael Garnier, the French prime minister. He was forced to a
Yes.
vote of no confidence by the far right, led in France by Marie Le Pen, and he lost that. But President Emmanuel Macron has vowed to stay in power regardless of what happens to his prime minister. And what I was talking with Benjamin a little bit about earlier was that the far right in Europe has used women, or generally the far right in most of the world, has used women as a symbol to kind of lessen the message of extremism, but also to make it seem like the more traditional people would be more attracted to their ideas because these people are usually of a specific Christian sect or of a humble background. You have any thoughts on that?
Not really.
Not really, it's just what it is.
Yeah.
And
I
then
mean, both sides of the aisle are using women,
I guess,
to,
oh yeah, because well,
so,
Kamala I think is an isolated incident, right? Because
I mean,
Marjorie Taylor Greene, the governor of South Dakota, Nikki Haley. Well, Nikki Haley is an extreme, actually. So I take Nikki Haley back. But the governor of South Dakota and Marjorie Taylor Greene have both been partially weaponized, I would say. At least in my belief. Because, see, Marjorie Taylor Greene, like, she could have been a normal congresswoman, but she decides to be, outright blatant in her ideologies. Nothing wrong with that. But she is very forward, proposing in her ideas that align with MAGA ideology. And then, so also some happenings in the world right now. There's still a civil war in Ethiopia between the Tigray and the government forces, which is actually kind of hidden in the world because there's so many conflicts going on, but particularly conflicts in Africa right now are getting hidden. And actually, there was almost a genocide of the Tigray people by the government of Ethiopia by direct famine and aid blocking. Have you heard about this, Benjamin?
I don't think I have.
But basically, this there's an eternal ethnic war that it's never stopping because the people just hate each other, and every time one group fights back, the other group is just going to hit back in a few years. And though the Tigray are a much smaller percentage of the country, they have been able to attack the government. But their ideas are inherently not not structurally sane for how Tanzania should be run because theoretically what they're proposing is to be a minority who rules over the majority, which would be wrong. Be-
Rafa, a war between ethnic groups, you just described pretty much the entire Middle East and a significant portion of African countries.
yes, but okay, well, Syria, it wasn't an ethnic group, right?
Syria was control of the government.
Kuwait in the 90s wasn't an ethnic group.
Kuwait in the 90s was over oil, but also just like Saddam Hussein was out for some land. So it's either power, money, or ethnic groups slash religion.
I believe there is some discontent with the religious boundaries in Ethiopia due to the fact that it's pretty much a 50-50 split between Muslim and Christian. And cool fact about Ethiopia, I think it's like the weird cousin of the other Christian kingdoms. And basically, instead of going to Western Europe, apparently there are a bunch of Christians that went down to Ethiopia, and there's like an entire Ethiopian uh, Orthodox church down there. I think that was a good conversation about what happened in the world, and thank you for listening to the 17th episode of the Student Recap Podcast. Hope you guys have a great holiday.